So I'm super excited that you could all join us tonight to talk about our great topic, dementia and human flourishing, which I think is just so on point. One of the exciting things for me is I found out tonight that our speaker Cindy and I went to the same boarding school way back in high school, so that was really exciting for me to have a little bit of a flashback. So anyways, let's get started. So we're delighted to be joined tonight by Cindy Lewans. She is the Associate Chaplain at Sherbrooke Community Centre and Central Haven Long-Term Care Homes, following the Eden Alternative Philosophy. For the past 8 years, she has had the grace and privilege of journeying with people, including those living with dementia, in a mutual quest for spiritual health and full life. We're also joined tonight with myself, Nicole Scheidl. So I'm the Executive Director for Canadian Physicians for Life, and also Amanda Achtman, who is responsible for our cultural and education programming with Canadian Physicians for Life. So we're delighted to be able to have this conversation. So Cindy, first of all, I wanted to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the Eden Alternative Philosophy and what that is, and kind of just a little bit about it so we kind of situate ourselves for this discussion tonight.
Sure, be glad to. So, back in the 90s, a Dr. Bill Thomas, a regular GP physician in the States, was making his rounds in nursing homes. He was visiting residents, and he was attending to this one resident who had a rash, and he thought he had looked at all the physical needs that were needed there, and he said, "Is there anything else I can do for you before I go?" And she grabbed a hold of his arm and said, "It's just that, doctor, I'm so lonely." And so in that moment, Dr. Bill Thomas said that it was sort of like this spark went off in his head. He just realized that there's a greater need here that we're not addressing. And so he went on to develop what he calls the Eden alternative philosophy. So what he recognized in his work, and because of that encounter, is that a lot of nursing homes or long-term care homes are built on the hospital model. And so if if we took a quick survey here, I'm willing to bet if I asked any of you if you wanted to live for a long term in a hospital, how many of you would raise your hand? I'm thinking not very many of us.
Like no one
Like no
raised their
one.
hand.
So this is what he came to realize. And he said that what he noted in his experience and in his ministering to residents in nursing homes, he said that they were suffering from the three plagues of nursing homes: loneliness, boredom, and helplessness. And the thing is, we all know how to address those needs, those plagues. Loneliness, you need companionship. Boredom, you need meaningful activity. And helplessness happens when we always are receiving care and help, but we never get a chance to reciprocate. So he decided that we need to develop long-term care homes that are focused on building, like encouraging a human habitat. Basically, what is more homey for us? What is the kind of environment that we would thrive in? And so that's where the Eden alternative philosophy came from.
So I want to just like focus in on one thing you said there, because I'm really interested in how you actually make that happen in reality, is this sense of helplessness and them being able to help. Because often when you're in long-term care, you're there because you're quite fragile or frail. You don't have a lot of capacity for physical movement anymore. So how do you make that happen for them in their everyday?
Right. So, for a lot of us, this is actually just being really present to what's around in the environment, what you know about their story, and what interested them and what they did in the past. I'm going to just give you a couple of examples, and I recognize that mine is specific to being in a long-term care home. But when I first began at Sherbrooke Community Centre, my office was situated right in a memory care unit, and I always had the door to my office open. Now, I wish I had a green thumb, but I don't. Might as well like just say that right now. So anyway, I had these plants in my office, but I wasn't doing a very good job of taking care of them. Well, guess what? at least most of the residents in that area had experience in gardening, whatnot, you name it, they did it with plants. And so I had women, I recognized that after a while that if I just asked the women to help me take care of my plants, that was a huge thing. There's other ways though, when we're thinking that maybe some capacities might not be um, they might not be able to in the moment. We all have emotional needs. We all have emotional needs. If we have a connection with the person and it's not too strange to them, I've had moments where I've said, I'm having a hard day today. Could I have a hug? You would not believe the kind of response that you get from people that just get the chance to care for you. So, and I think if you've ever had an experience where you're being taken care of long term, that sense of helplessness that you get is really, people will talk, they might not be able to think of the word, but we can all like try to articulate in it in some way or another. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And I think that's so true is we all have a capacity to love no matter what, no matter how disabled we may be, no matter what physical capacities we've lost, we always have that capacity to love. And that is something that we can always give the world. So I think that's so beautiful.
And if I could just tag on to that, just to acknowledge and affirm another person, to show in some way that you are glad to be in their presence goes a long, long way. And I think if we can all tap into a moment where we felt like another person was fully present to us, where we got the sense that they didn't want to be, they weren't, their mind wasn't somewhere else, they were fully present to us, I think we can all say what an impact that has. And it does, even if it's just for a few seconds, a few moments.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for all of this. And so far, I would also just like if you could share a little bit more about your specific role. What does it entail? Perhaps what is in the job description and what is not in the job description that is very much part of the job.
Okay. So what I do as an associate chaplain, honestly, is a lot of supporting people in whatever they're experiencing at the moment. And so a lot of what I do, honestly, is listening. It's listening. It's practicing being attentive and being present and kind of being a witness to what people are going to. And so, because for a lot of times, a lot of the moments, people are being diagnosed with something that they're just trying to get used to. Um, or there's family members that are just moving a loved one into long-term care and it was unexpected. And so there's all these losses of independence, of all these sorts of things. And so people are needing a place to vent, to share, to have someone listen to and say, that sounds hard. Um, I do a lot of prayer as well with people. I do a lot of reminding people or exploring with people, even in the midst of what they are going through, whatever is painful, whatever is suffering, what still remains, what can still be celebrated, and what can still be looked forward to.
Hmm.
So,
I want to pick up on that in particular because we know, according to the government's annual reports related to euthanasia, that the number one kind of suffering that people say leads to their requests for euthanasia is not pain or the fear of pain, not being a burden, not financial. These are all on the list, but they're not the top. The very top is loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. And
mhm.
I think those numbers are even higher in the latest report just released today by Health Canada, that it's really the predominant underlying suffering by people's own admission that leads them to say, I'm out. I've had enough. My life is complete and there's nothing more to live for, to look forward to. So in light of that, what do you have to say and to speak into this climate where so many think that the loss of meaningful activities signals that life is over?
Okay. So I would just want to highlight something that I think that response doesn't mention, but I think it might be implied or connected to as a corollary, if I can. So yes, the fear of a loss of meaningful activity. But what I find also not mentioned in there, and that I think is also a fear, is lack of connection, a loss of connection. Because let's face it, a lot of our meaningful activities don't just happen in a silo. They don't necessarily, yes, reading, watching movies, maybe some of those things can, but not in the long term. We are hardwired for connection.
We want to share what we read, we want to share what we watched.
Yes, exactly. So it doesn't just stop there. And so actually what I see in that response is actually indicative of how much we have become disconnected because a loss of meaningful activity. If I went back over those plagues that I just mentioned to you that Bill Thomas highlighted there, all of them can really become rampant when you lose connection, when you lose connection with others. And so actually, I think that that response is actually just even indicative of how much more individualistic we've become. And so that we think, because I think a lot of people erroneously believe that actually all of our meaningful activity is initiated just by ourselves. I think we'd be hard pressed to identify a lot of activities. We don't live in silos. So, about that, I just want to offer, first of all, that we need alternative stories. We need to know alternative realities that are out there. And so the overriding predominant story, and I'm not saying that we don't need some of this, but is the biomedical diagnosis or erroneous prognosis that once you have dementia, all we see is this physical brain that's deteriorating, right? It's atrophy, and there's a loss of capacity, a loss of ability, a loss of being able to initiate these meaningful activities. So there is a lot of fear out there. Like I hear in that response that you just gave a lot of fear. And it's a lot of thinking that, oh, did I just go
Oh,
off?
yeah, you got a little too excited with your hand
I
movements.
did. Okay,
Turned
I got to
off your,
stop that.
turned off your.
Um, that we we tend to think that, yeah, it's
One
all
second.
dependent on ourselves. That we have to autonomously, independently of anyone else, initiate and continue this being having the meaningful activity or being meaningful engaged. Well, guess what? That doesn't happen independently. And the story out there is all the focus on defectology and loss rather than on what still remains. And I just want to mention this name right now before I forget. If you haven't heard of the name of Christine Bryden, Bryden, I really encourage you to Google her. She is, she would call herself a dementia survivor, but she is challenging this predominant paradigm or story that she's written 5 books since her diagnosis of early onset dementia in 1995. And she was a biochemist
Wow.
giving, advising the Prime Minister in Australia. She's written 5 books on the subject of her experience of dementia, as well as incorporating stories of other people living with dementia. And what she says in her final book, well, final, maybe there's another one to come, the last book that I saw, Will I Still Be Me? She tackles this overriding fear that a lot of people have and the story that's out there that when you get diagnosed with dementia, that all you have to look forward to is a total loss of yourself, that you will become this shell. And it's totally forgetting that as long as that actually no one of us is fully independent or autonomous, like for all of us here, even just to get where we got in life, I'm sure it took a village, right?
Sure.
And so, sorry, I think I'm going on and on here, but
Yeah, no, but I think this is really interesting because I do think there's a lot of fear around this diagnosis. And there, because often what happens, there is so much separation of people that you don't really have a normal experience of living with someone or having someone in your life who has dementia, and that you just adjust and cope with it, and they're still part of your life. And I
so
think it becomes the unknown disease that everyone's afraid of.
exactly, exactly. And so the focus is all on loss rather than what can still be, what is still present, what are still, because all of us, frankly, Christine Bryden deals with this so well in her book. We all deal in our lives with looking back at where we've been and trying to understand the person that we are becoming or how we've changed, right? We're all like working with different narratives or perceptions of ourselves, other people's perceptions of us, our own perception of ourselves. And some people have written books on this topic about how I'm thinking of John Swinton in his book Living in the Memories of God. And he talks about how in his work as a psych nurse with people that have lived with dementia, of how oh, I'm losing my train of thought, of how their personhood is not lost, that that maybe some capacities or the way they see themselves has changed, but dementia is as much a relational and a social condition as it is a neurological one. And this is something we need to pay attention to because as long as the overriding conversation is on loss and defectology, and we reduce people to that affects how we relate. And I have to say, in my experience with people with dementia, that they have helped me become more human. They are helping me become more human. I just want to offer that.
I would like to, in reaction to that, raise the remarks by one of our Canadian senators who is currently advocating for advance requests, which have already been ushered in Quebec, for persons with dementia to be able to, upon receiving a diagnosis, even though they may live for many, many, many years with this condition, to preemptively put in their request and signal their intention to end their lives prematurely if it gets worse. This senator has said, when you lose your memory, you lose your family and friends and your feeling of being loved. The end of memory is brutal. It is a denial of our time as people who mattered and made a difference. There are those who will argue that if folks are happy and tapping their toes at the weekly music session, then that is living. It is not. Happy dementia, they call it, when they want you to feel better about your loved one. How would you respond based on your own experiences and convictions to the remarks by this Canadian senator?
So I have to say that I'm wrestling with two responses within myself. The first of all is that I hear a lot of pain in that sharing. And I recognize that there is difficulty and challenges in making this journey, as there is with any condition. Um, so I sometimes wonder, in my experience, family members and friends, some may have difficulty in trying, there is a mourning or a grieving. I'll give you an example from my own experience with my father who has Alzheimer's. And I admit that there have been times along the journey with him that I have grieved. I have grieved the conversations that I want to have with him, but I feel that I can't. Now, does this mean, though, that I am not able to have, or that we are not able to have meaningful relational encounters? Not at all. Not at all. I find it very dangerous, and I find that response of that senator maybe tapping into a very narrow understanding of what memory is. Because memory isn't just chronological recall memory, right? And I think maybe a lot of us have had this experience where, I know I've mentioned this before, you probably had the experience maybe of like where you're with a group of friends or family and you start sharing, like talking about a shared memory. And then has it ever happened to you where someone else in the group says, wait a minute, that's not what happened. You're not, yeah, I see some smiles. Yeah. So memory is not something we do internally and only on our own. It's not just an individual, it's not just internal and individual, it's a communal effort. So when I hear from another family or friend, another part of the memory that I didn't notice or I forgot, I am grafting that onto my memory. And now that becomes part of our, we can't do memory independently. So I would challenge this senator that I wonder if she is only going by what she notices on the outside. And I'm sure we've all had the experience where someone talks to us or responds to us and they don't know what's going on inside of us. How can we say we know exactly what's going on inside? I've had so many experiences with my father whereby we don't necessarily share something with words, but the way he looks at me and the way I look at him and our smile, or even just a shared, recently, my sister was able to have a ramp built in her garage so we could get my father up in his wheelchair into her house. And he said when he was unloaded from the taxi, you know what he said? He just looked at us and he said, "Isn't it lovely?" Now, maybe we're not having these long involved conversations. My father was a community advocate and a lawyer for 40 plus years. I'm not going to be sitting down and talking to him about the demise of the political parties these days. I used to, but you know what? Does it matter? No, because there are other conversations and there are other encounters to be had.
What do you think it takes in order to become capable of seeing the value of those kinds of encounters and interactions? Does it take a kind of training in being
Definitely takes,
human?
you know what? Yes, there's some education, but honestly, I think the more all of us, and I would just challenge us to recall some of the most meaningful encounters of our life. Now, I'm not saying people with dementia are akin to being infants, but for those of you who are mothers or parents or grandparents, have you ever held your child and your grandchild and you just look at them and they look at you, or you touch each other? When you were dating the love of your life, were words always necessary? And I'm not saying that words can't be exchanged with someone with dementia. I'm not saying that at all. But we've got to broaden, just because this is happening at certain times in our lives, we've got to get away from the overarching Western liberal democratic value system that autonomy and hypercognitive intellectual. And please, I'm not saying we don't need to have intellectual, please, I'm not saying that. But that's not the only things that we value in each other, is it?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something that you had said about how being with the women who were helping you with your plants was making you a better human being. Because I reflect on, like, my father's getting frail. My older brother is lives in the same city, does a tremendous amount of personal care for him. For me, it's amazing. Like, my admiration for my brother is just growing in leaps and bounds, just watching him walk this journey with my dad. And I think about his kids watching him
Mhm.
do that, and thinking about how that's impacting them and their capacity to care. And I wonder if in our society, if we so denigrate people that need us in this more dependent way, that we're losing an opportunity to grow as human beings, but we're also creating a callousness in our society that means we don't care for those who need help.
Yes, and um, so I would also put forth that, yeah, we need a revival of virtue ethics. What kind of person do I want to become? What kind of people do we want to become? What kind of society do we want to create for our children, for ourselves, for our grandchildren, you know? Um, and I think also when we, I think also a lot of this stems from too, that we're not actually very caring towards ourselves either. I have had too many encounters with people. So maybe you're familiar with Dr. Kristen Neff with self-compassion. And she talks about how often when we're going through difficult times, we're we need to treat ourselves as we would a really good friend. But lots of times we're really harsh on ourselves. And I think sometimes this is something that we don't want to admit is at the root of a lot of this, that it's hard to be compassionate with others because we're not so compassionate with ourselves either when we aren't so capable or productive or efficient.
It's a good point because it goes to why it becomes so much more fearful for any of these experiences to happen. If we were the kind of society that rushed toward others in a moment of crisis, or the kind of society that honored and revered the elders, or any kinds of social conditions which could just as well be otherwise. And that reminds me of a section of a book by Catherine Frazier, disability rights scholar. And she says that the condition of disability is situated not in the body, but in the body politic, in a failure to take into account the needs and circumstances of a particular group of citizens. It's not an individual pathology or a medical failure, but rather a social pathology and a failure to embrace diverse ways of being in the world. So all of the hope, I think, that we can bring to this conversation largely comes from the very simple reality that we can change the situation. We can create the conditions in which it's not terrifying to receive this diagnosis. On the contrary, you know exactly that you and we know that we exactly how it's going to go. The narrative will be different. The reality will be different. Nicole, I saw you were about to jump
Yeah,
in,
no,
and then maybe.
I want to circle back to what you said about not caring or being compassionate with yourself. And I wonder if part of it is I don't want to recognize in myself that I'm not autonomous and I don't have it all together. And all of a sudden there's cracks in my armor. And oh my goodness, I don't want to look at that. And I can't admit to myself that I don't have it all together or that I might need someone else.
Indeed, indeed, exactly. And I think if we think about it, I think a lot of I'm thinking of a lot of work situations, not necessarily the Sherbrooke Community Center where we're at work now, but where the implied or the unspoken rules was look like you have it all together, look like you. And we suffer from that. We suffer from that. And so there's this I'm thinking of something that has helped me become more human in being with people that have dementia is it really makes you really need to be more present. You really need to be a friend of time, a friend of time, and a friend of who's the person that's unfolding before me, within me. And that we don't know, we don't have that all encased right in a box in front of us. Just to being open to what comes before us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So I'm gonna just give you one little challenge and then maybe we can open up for people to ask questions. What I'll do is when we go to questions, I'll shut the recording off so people can feel free to really ask what's on their mind. But one thing before we go to that is what one thing or two things or whatever, how many things you want to say, could someone do to start making a change? We know change starts with one person taking action. What are some actions that you could see someone taking that would help to make a difference in this space?
In this space with someone that has dementia, or you just mean in the whole this
Well, I guess let's either. I mean, with someone
yeah.
who has dementia or just like I think if you don't have that experience, you might feel a bit reluctant or unsure on to how to move forward.
S- Oh,
Oh, Amanda, you are
Yeah.
muted.
muted.
And so just to expound on that, I would say if someone does not yet have that experience of walking with someone who has dementia, how can we dispose ourselves to become more prepared and more apt to live that encounter in the way that we're not going to miss the opportunity that you've begun to highlight for us?
So one thing I think we've highlighted a lot of is don't let the fear or the overriding story win out. It's not the final story or the final word. And if when you've met one person who has dementia, you've met one person that has dementia. So the experience is as varied as people themselves, right? So think of, we all know how to develop relationships. We all know how to get to know someone and let them get to know us. If you think of yourself, if you had to come into long-term care, what would you want your caregivers to know about you that would give you a sense of meaning, a sense of hope, a sense of, I want to get out of bed. I want to, or gives you a sense of comfort when you're feeling nervous or anxious. Those all still apply with people that coming to know that their story, their what was their what were their occupations, their careers? What were they passionate about? Was it teaching children? Was it teaching music? Was it caring for animals, living on the farm? Was it music? All those sorts of things still apply. Dementia does not change that story of getting to know people. It might modify some things along the way, but you know what? Every time you get to know someone, that's what you're doing anyway, right? So I just want to put that forth because I think a lot of fear stops us. And so a lot of people fall away because they don't want to make things worse or they don't want to, when actually, and I have to say, I've made every mistake in the book. I'm sure I will continue to make many, many, many mistakes. And they're all redeemable, because we all know how to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was just trying to, whatever. I don't know if that helps, but I want to try to normalize it a bit because I think there's too much fear that keeps people away.
Thank you
That's
so
great.
much.
Thank
That
you.
was really beautiful.